Yes, thank you. Let me share my screen with all of you, and it's really a pleasure and honor to be here. As Christian was sharing, I'm not sure if I deserve all of these really high comments, but I'm super thrilled to be here because I'm not seeing myself as a philosopher, but I do work with philosophical ideas and more broadly, conceptual ideas and conceptual analysis explorations. And we were having this discussion, how should I have the title this seminar? Christian suggested me to use ontology, but I'm not sure if ontology is the best word. So we then use philosophies, as you can see on this slide. And also, you can also see that from the slide and the book title. In the book title, I actually used approaches rather than philosophies. This was because the approaches that I was referring to include traditions and philosophical ideas, cultural ideas, and more broadly, like ontological ideas as well, including ontological ideas. So that you will find from my my later presentation that this is a little bit broad than what philosophy may categorizing a lot of things, because I know that philosophy has, as a discipline, as a branch of discipline, it has its boundaries. But I'm really looking forward to philosophers' feedback and comments. So a little bit of information about the overall of the book. So the book is guided by a few general questions, primarily three. The first one is, what would the Chinese and Anglo-American traditions tell us about the state, society, higher education, and the intersections between them? And secondly, what are the differences and similarities between the two traditions? And finally, are there possibilities for combination? Of course, I will be talking about what do I mean by combination and how that can be achieved, and what are the challenges that may be involved in trying to combine ideas from these very diverse and different traditions. And the central notion here is the public good of higher education, which is understood and explored through the intersections between higher education and four primary spheres of social action, including the individual, society, state, and world, which I will explain why I use this intersection as a primary lens of analysis further later on. So the underlying idea of the whole exploration that is that creativity is often sparked by the collision of ideas, and being two highly different but profoundly influential traditions of the world today, both Chinese and Anglo-American traditions have much to offer separately and also combined. And they also have much to learn from each other. You can see from this table what I mean by the two highly rich traditions is kind of can be regarded as really different and new school of thought, starting from Enlightenment. So I primarily look at six philosophers, particularly political philosophers, their works, including John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, John Dewey, John Rawls, and Amartya Sen. So the overall objective of this comparison and combination was trying to establish a broader and more comprehensive understanding of the public good of higher education that can work on a cross-cultural basis and facilitate mutual understanding and cooperation in higher education across contexts. This is because that there is a lack of understanding, clarity of what the public good of higher education means in each single context. And this become more complicated at the world level. And for example, now the overall dominant one is economic approach to the public good, like when the market fails, we need to have the involved government to produce certain sort of public good. And also these are, as I will discuss later on, it's imagined based on a certain kind of social imaginary. And there is a need to further clarify what this concept, what this broad idea means, and particularly in different contexts, and how we can learn and understand each other. So I trust that we would all agree that higher education plays a public role and produces public goods. And as I mentioned, there is a lack of clarity of this. This will affect cooperation and common action. For example, when we mean higher education should contribute to the global public good, what do we mean by the global public good here? And who should financially invest in global public good? And the varying understandings and practice of the public good of higher education are closely related to the political and educational cultures, particularly the social imaginaries, which is understood as you can see from the figures, as how a specific tradition of political culture, educational culture view the world or view the society. And in the two examined traditions in this book, on the one hand, there is the Chinese social imaginary, in which you can see that state has a comprehensive role that takes in all aspects, including higher education. And the state has the comprehensive mandate for order and prosperity and the collective good. Smaller spheres, including, for example, individual, family, compared with the larger spheres, they are nested within the larger spheres. And the good of the larger spheres would take precedence over the smaller spheres, smaller spheres good. But on the other hand, there is the Anglo-American tradition in the English-speaking countries in which the state is separated from civil society and the market. While the civil society and market are not commanded by a comprehensive state, but remain at least partly independent, as this figure shows. And this embodies the idea of the division of powers in the Anglo-American social imaginary. And the individual and the family are highly autonomous and partly overlap with the three collective spheres. And essential to this social imaginary is the need to restrain the scope of the state and protect the individual sphere against potential intrusion from the other, particularly from the state and sometimes from civil society. Well, then what I did was to look at the intersections between higher education and each of the four spheres of social action. And I found that the varying social imaginaries will lead to distinctive ideas and practice of at least 5 key aspects of higher education. And for example, when we look at the intersection between higher education and the individual, we can easily think about the individual development and cultivation of students in higher education. Of course, there can be other themes from these intersections. I'm primarily looking at individual student development for this intersection between individual sphere and higher education. And between higher education and sphere of society, I'm looking at social equity and equity in education, in higher education. And third one, with the state, I'm looking at academic freedom and university autonomy in higher education, because it relates with the relationship between the university and also the state. And between higher education and the world, I'm looking at the global good of higher education. And finally, when higher education intersects with all of these different spheres, there are always contributions, outcomes of higher education to these different spheres of social actions. And then I was looking at the individual and collective outcomes of higher education, particularly to each of these spheres. What I was highlighting here, you may see, is that for each theme, I'm using a pair of terms, one from the Chinese language and the other from the English language. Of course, Bildung is an exception because Bildung, even though it's a German word, but the idea of Bildung has been so influential, not only in German world, but also in English-speaking world and globally. So that I argue that Bildung and also its take by those Anglo-American philosophers, for example, the idea on liberty, individual development of free agency by Amartya Sen, these all and John Dewey, these are all reflection of John Dewey's idea of growth and experience. These are all reflections of influence of Bildung on the Anglo-American world. So the reason of including both Chinese terms and English terms is related with a formidable methodological challenge here that I came across, because the term, the public good, the term is an English term. And it was really difficult for me to identify an equivalence of Chinese term of this word. There isn't such a Chinese equivalence of it. The best I can find are approximations rather than equivalence. And by writing a work in English, there is also the tendency of benchmarking against the English ideas and link English literature. But this was what I hope to avoid. I hope to avoid this unequal treatment of two traditions, and hope to treat them equally, avoid benchmarking, avoid privileging over the other. So I developed this methodology for exploration, comparison, combination that takes into account these challenges and pay special attention to the equal treatment of the two traditions, which I call the two-step transpositional comparative methodology that draws on Amartya Sen's idea of transpositionality. I don't have much time to talk about this, but I hope if you are interested, we can have further discussion afterwards. And you can also see the lexical-based comparison, which highlights the issue of translation of language when doing comparison, and try to avoid the missing interpretations or misunderstandings after the translation. Anyway, these are all some background information of the overall research. Then here I am sharing with you the major findings from my comparison of the 5 pairs of terms. You can see these different figures. These are the summary of the major findings. They're complex. What I would do later is to use one as an example to zoom in a bit. So just the general idea, you will see the gray areas. The gray areas are highlighting the overlaps and commonalities between the two traditions, and all other aspects, all other parts are suggesting the differences. And as you can see, a lot of overlaps are sort of superficial or direct manifestations of those varying underlying philosophical ideas. For example, the assumptions of the world, the worldview, the assumptions of the human nature, so on and so forth, they differ between the two traditions differ, but in the end, they manage to overlap in some superficial manifestations. What do I mean by that? I will use this second pair of terms, equity and 公平 as an example to zoom in to show you how I did the exploration and comparison, combination, and what the two traditions suggest us about this. So in discussing equality and equity in higher education, Amartya Sen asked the question of equality of what to show the divergent emphasis on different aspects of equality. For example, equality of opportunities, equality of outcomes, equality of gender, equality of race, and so on and so forth. And concerning higher education, there are equality of opportunity in access, and equality of social outcomes from higher education, equality of experience during higher education, and many others. Not all of the equality of which I understand as constitutes of social equity are mutually compatible. Societies may prioritize certain ones over the other. For example, equality of opportunity often receives more emphasis in the Anglo-American world than equality of social outcomes, which is different from like many continental European countries. Underlying these equality of are different cultural and philosophical rationales. Therefore, I examine the philosophical rationales for social equity in the two different traditions. And let's start with the Anglo-American tradition first. Well, through an exploration of these are relevant ideas, I found that there are mainly 3 philosophical rationales for social equity. The first one is the rationale of democracy, second one, the rationale of social justice, and finally, the rationale of social order. I will go through them one by one, even though quite briefly. The first one is democracy, which is a primary rationale and distinguishes this approach, this tradition from the Chinese one, because well, in the English speaking countries, Anglo-American world, democracy is really a fundamental thing. And a democratic society requires the elimination of political privileges. And such liberal equality is also essential as a condition of universal individual freedom. So it's believed that with equal rights and status, individuals are provided with equal access to participate in public affairs. And the second rationale is social justice. According to John Rawls, the social justice stipulates at least two kinds of equality: equality of basic liberties and social and economic equality. And social justice is an important, essential rationale for equity in Anglo-American world as well. And the final one, not final one. Also, there is one more aspect of social justice, which is quite different from what John Rawls was suggesting. According to Amartya Sen, social justice can only be attained when there is equality of freedom to achieve, rather than just basic liberty, equality, and as what the fair distribution of wealth and income. In my view, Amartya Sen moved forward to argue for providing equal means, equal opportunities, and equal resources for every individual to develop substantial freedom. And here, the external support is the key, which is a really important point, and I will come back later because this is less emphasized in the Chinese tradition. And even though, what I want to highlight is that even though Amartya Sen's equality of freedom to achieve is, in my view, inspirational and thought-provoking and really important, but it's not the determinant or mainstream liberal view, unfortunately. The third one is the rationale of social order, which is not as essential or fundamental as the democracy and social justice rationale. According to John Rawls, that social equity helps to maintain social order by keeping a moderate level of social inequality. So it's a good rather than a fundamental necessity. But democracy and social justice are fundamental necessity rather than good. So this is an overview of the constitutes of social equity in the Anglo-American world based on my analysis of the rationales. There are political and civil equality, social and economic equality, including fair equality of opportunity, fair distribution of wealth, and also equality of freedom to achieve, which is a really important one. I will come back later. And let me move on. I'm not sure why it's not working. Okay. So let's turn to the Chinese tradition now to leave the Anglo-American side for a while. I found that the primary philosophical rationale for social equity in the Chinese tradition is social order, with a component of social justice included. So in other words, social justice is part of the core or necessity of social order. Well, the modern concept of social equity was introduced to China in the mid-19th century. And at that time, social equity mainly referred to equality of status and rights, and political and economic equality became an important constitute in the Chinese world. However, I still want to highlight that social equity was already an intrinsic principle of the Confucian tradition before this introduction in the 19th century. Equity is equality of potential to self-cultivate that assumes moral equality. And in other words, Confucianism assumes that every individual has equal potential to self-cultivate and become a sage, to realize the ultimate aim of self-cultivation. And the key determinant of this process is not the external environment, as what I was highlighting earlier, that the Anglo-American tradition really highlights the external environment, but here it's not highlighted or emphasized. It's individuals' personal efforts and characters, including determination, diligence, perseverance, resilience, and many other characteristics that matter. So in contrast to Amartya sense equality of freedom to achieve emphasizes external environment. Confucian equality of potential to self-cultivate centers around individuals' personal commitment. Confucian, because a lot of only pay lip service to equality. But according to Confucius, social and economic equality is actually crucial to the maintenance of social order, including social justice. Even Confucius personally argues for the even distribution of wealth. Moderate social and economic inequality is justified partly by the meritocratic tradition in China, and also something that the political team accession. And as this slide shows, for the constitutes of social equity in the Chinese world, there are primarily 4, and some of them are introduced from the West. The West is a big word, but I'm using for convenience from the West. First is social and economic equality, which we see the foundation from the Confucianism. And political and civil equality came from the West. Equality of opportunity also largely from the West, particularly in the last few decades. And finally, equality of potential to self-cultivate, which is sort of a unique idea from Confucianism. So again, here comes again this figure that I did the comparison. Well, it's obvious that the two traditions differ in many aspects. For example, the different philosophical rationales, but they overlap on social equity constitutes. Except for equality of freedom to achieve in the Anglo-American and equality of potential to self-cultivate in the Chinese traditions, the other constitutes in either tradition have resonance in the other, as this figure show. As the goal of this comparison is to identify differences and similarities and search for hybridizations based on these pinpointed complementarities or these differences and overlaps. So the overlapped social equity constitutes, namely political and civil equality, social and economic equality, and equality of opportunity, can act as a common bridge across the two worlds in discussing social equity. However, noting that their philosophical foundations vary and are correspondingly nuanced by context is also necessary. So then I want to highlight how I bridge or hybridize these two traditions on this topic. So in searching for these common terminologies, one possibility is to reinterpret and hybridize the somewhat contrasting concepts of equality of freedom to achieve and equality of potential to self-cultivation. You can see that the equality of freedom to achieve highlights the external opportunities, resources, and means that are important external supports and for the individual's self-development and self-cultivation, self-formation, while the equality of potential to self-cultivate highlight the equality of potential of every individual in their formation, their internal formation and personal characters are emphasized. So these one external and one internal are somehow complementary to each other. So one possibility is to combine the two and to develop this complementarity. So on the one hand, the Anglo-American one only considers X supports in the development of the individual capability, despite that one of the main focuses of equality of freedom to achieve is the development of the agency, but it's somehow it's not the dominant narrative in Anglo-American world. And in addition, external support tend to favor individuals who are more talented, following the assumption of inequality of human talent and capacity. And the emphasis on personal characters such as perseverance, diligence, and resilience is relatively little. And in many social fields, including higher education, meritocratic tendency is prominent. For example, in higher education admission, the already attained achievements are often considered in admission, whereas individual potential in achieving further during higher education and after higher education is somewhat overlooked. And this oversight, I argue, can be complemented by the Chinese approach. So the equality of potential to self-cultivate assumes that all human beings can equally become a sage through self-perfectionism, which is largely a personal journey. And the success relies on personal efforts, but it overlooks or underemphasizes the external supports for the individual to self-develop, leaving the social disadvantaged individuals lacking necessary opportunities and resources, and then therefore reinforcing social inequality. And this overlooking of external supports, I argue, can be complemented by the Anglo-American approach. So if we combine this external and internal emphasis, we can have this final idea of equality of potential and freedom to self-cultivate or to achieve freedom. So, and I also argue that this equality can be maximized when the external conditions are harmonized with the individual effort. That is, when social structure and agency are combined, collective action conditions and individual are combined, and the outer and inner self are combined. So that's one of the major combination of the two traditions for these parallel theme. I don't have enough time to go through all of the 5 themes, but I only include these major findings from each of these pairs here to give you an overview of what I found, the major arguments. So first, with the individual development, I argue that theoretically, the optimum situation for individual student development arises when individual agency is harmonized with the external environment. And this is in line with my second argument with regard to social equity, which I just talked about. And third one, I argue that there is no universal idea of academic freedom and university autonomy, just given that we just look at the different social imaginaries and different assumptions and views towards state, what states can do and its relationship with other spheres of social action and with higher education. But the two traditions agree that protecting these qualities in higher education requires the efforts to build mutual trust. Of course, these qualities are variously understood in different contexts. And the mutual trust include both between higher education and society and between higher education and the state. I think the trust between higher education and the state has been much emphasized mostly, but the trust between higher education and society needs more attention from us, in my personal view, considering now the and criticism of science and mistrust of science, so on and so forth, and the ongoing tensions between higher education experts and the general society. And the fourth one is that the core for being more cautious about nationalist ideas, underlying the concepts of global public and common goods, particularly how we understand global here. And I argue that the Chinese idea of 天下, which I've also published a few more articles after the book, actually they came out before the book, but the work was actually done after the book, regarding how the 天下 all under heaven idea provides an alternative way, a different way of thinking about the world as a whole planet, rather than a series of nation states as a methodological nationalism would suggest. And finally, I propose a series, a set of terms, a transpositional set of terms to capture higher education's outcomes, including the collective goods as common goods, collective goods as governmental produced and owned public goods, collective goods as normative collective goods, and individualized goods. I think the Chinese tradition, it's one of its unique contribution and major contributions is highlighting of the normative collective goods. the highlighting of values and moral qualities in this what is good deserves attention. Okay, that's from my sharing. Sorry for a bit of promoting. I'm attaching this flyer here. If you hope to have a look at the book, read the book, feel free, you're welcome, invited to suggest the book to your library, and this flyer will give you some extra discount. Okay, that's all from me. I will hand over the
And I think that we can keep this advertisement posted for some time, or you can simply send the link to that flyer like in the chat in the meantime, because what is clear probably for everybody after this brilliant talk is that there's way much of the material contained in the book that short half-an-hour presentation can offer, and probably way more than we can digest during this short time. But I'm sure that you have questions for clarifications, comments, and also we can start some sort of a dialogue. I have many questions to Lily because I'm fascinated by her research, like for long time, and I can continue for the remaining part of the seminar, but I'm giving the floor to you to simply get a chance to ask questions and enter into dialogue with Lily. You can simply put your hand up or simply start. We're in a small crowd, so. Okay, Franek and Asger as next. Come on, Franek.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting comparison. Can you hear what I say? The sound okay? Good.
Yes.
I should tell you that I have a lot of experience with Chinese universities, and I come from Denmark, and I also have experiences with the Anglophone community. So I can recognize a lot of what you say in your analysis from experience. There is something interesting that I may mention to you, that there is actually a strong tradition that we in Northern Europe, in the Germanophone language communities, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Germany, that we often relate to. And if Christian Sarkowski is from Polonia, he probably knows what I'm talking about as well. This is the Humboldt tradition. And what I found extremely interesting was that your analysis, as you presented it now, was possible without mentioning some core words in the Humboldt tradition for higher education, and especially university higher education, because the idea of the university is very important in this tradition. And that would be something like truth, something like science, something like knowledge, which would be core issues. And what is very interesting is that you then accept one of the real hype words from that tradition, namely Bildung. And the idea of the Humboldt tradition would be that you can only achieve this kind of Bildung that is characteristic of the universities precisely because you are unconditionally interested in the truth. So that becomes something that goes beyond the state, beyond the world, beyond community, beyond the individual, as something which is the ultimate value. So it's kind of fundamentalism that is maybe even more severe than any of the two traditions that you actually analyze. So the Anglophone and the Chinese tradition, they have in common that it, I would say, is a way of educating the elite of society. And that could be elite in different societies, And when you have the Chinese society, which doesn't have the tradition for democracy, it's different from the Anglophone democratic society. But the Humboldt tradition would be more, in a way, fundamentally humanistic rather than political, social. So that's one thing. And that brings another thing forward in university education about Bildung that may actually also supplement some of your thinking, namely the idea of something that is not harmony and is not good, but which is still considered in this tradition almost necessary, namely alienation, that you are becoming something that you are not, in order to be able to get knowledge about what you could be. And therefore, the idea is that you should precisely learn something that you are so strange about that you become alienated. So these are ways of thinking about higher education that are different, even more different than I would say the differences that you analyze.
Okay, thank you, Asger. And I would say there's a lot to think of, and I would add to that yeah, one of the biggest challenges for this type of research is that you have to be selective, and especially when you compare it, like even within the Anglo-American tradition, we can distinguish like way more than a simple liberal tradition that offers different ways of thinking about higher education, society, assumes different ontologies, that assumes different aspects of what's important within the society, state, and so on. But at the same time, I would say that the same could go for Chinese side. I would say Chinese tradition, where, and Lily is quite aware of that there is like a strong I don't know, like Marxist tradition that assumes different sets of concepts and assumptions. But yeah, this is like a nice aspect of comparative research that yeah, emphasize the need for selectivity. Franek. Okay. Lily, maybe you want to respond, and or do you want to collect the questions or respond to them one by one?
Thank you, Christian. I hope you can hear me clearly, because my side shows that my internet is not stable, but I hope you can hear me clearly. If not, just let me know in the chat box.
Okay, now Lily freezed. Yeah, let's wait a bit for that. Oh yeah, you're again. Okay.
I'm so sorry that I dropped out because of the I just want to quickly respond, Asger. It's really helpful. As Christian said, I had to be selective while doing this comparison, but I do think that what you were sharing about Humboldt tradition, this humanistic tradition, is really interesting. Like the commitment to truth, which is what I am thinking about in the Chinese tradition, that has a strong pragmatic tradition there that is less interested in pure knowledge or truth, but more interested in applicability of the knowledge. And this is something that I think is really interesting if I look further. Also, I pay a lot of attention on to build on, and I also noticed this alienation while I was discussing build on. Thank you for that. Perhaps I wonder if you could share any recommendation for further reading about Humboldt tradition, because when I was looking at Humboldt, I noticed that a lot of his works were published in pieces and not in a collective work, and a lot of them were in German. I wonder, do you have any recommendations for English collections that look into this Humboldtian tradition?
I might find a few. Yes, there are some. Yes, we can be in contact afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Franek, third time in a row. Asking you.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for like really fascinating presentation. I definitely would have to take a closer look on your book. First my question I think already appeared. It was about that such comparison like necessarily like excludes like some others like traditions both in Anglo-American world and like both in like Chinese context for sure. So like maybe what would be how you could describe like what were your criteria for like choosing this tradition and not the other, because like probably we could argue that they are like maybe the most influential in like our current like state policies or something like that. And like connected with that, I was little wondering, maybe it is like something in this book about it, but like how would you think about like, especially from like historical perspective, like from the perspective of tradition, how both those like traditions were historically influenced by like their approach to imperialism as a social phenomena? Because like in US UK tradition for sure, like a lot of famous universities were just like maybe not just but also like schools for like colonial like governors and like people like clearly engaged in like imperial actions. And what I'm aware of, like a lot of like Chinese traditions were created in like opposition of like 100 years of like imperial Western influence over China. So like, would you think like this like quite opposite like opposite like situation to like opposite approaches to what imperialism is and should be like influenced like tradition of thinking about higher education?
Thank you. I think both questions are good questions. And the first one, that has been question that I've been struggling with over the course of the whole study, that how do I select materials, because the works that I select will determine in the end what I find, and if I change the materials, I may have different findings. So what I did was, as you were saying, is try to identify the most influential works, ideas in both worlds. And that led me to the Confucian ideas in the Chinese context. And of course, there are also a Buddhist idea and Taoist idea, and more recently Marxist ideas. But I think many would agree that Confucianism has been one of the major school of thought that has influenced China over the history of more than 2,000 years. So that's the reason. And again, I was highlighting the major influential works in Confucianism, because Confucianism as a school of thought can be approached too in different ways. And then for the Anglo-American world, the similar things, I was struggling with whom to include or not. In the end, as you can see, that I include those important liberal thinkers and scholars. If this is also confirmed by my reading and also some Anglo-American colleagues, philosophers, that these philosophers their ideas are fundamental to today's practice of society and the state, and also university in many ways. And if we look at those handbooks of liberalism, these scholars are very likely to, I think, absolutely will be included. Maybe not Amartya Sen, because he is less in terms of Anglo-American in many ways, but his work, his thoughts are definitely influential in many ways, and particularly illuminating for discussing higher education. That's how I selected the materials, and of course limitations are acknowledged as well. And in terms of the historical influence on these school of thought, I think there are definitely these ideas carry historical baggage. And also, of course, cultural baggage. And a typical example in the Chinese tradition is the concept of all under heaven, 天下. Even though I am appealing and calling for this idea of 天下 all under heaven, but people are also criticizing, because historically this idea was regarded as China at the center. I mean, there's one major approach to 天下 is China in the center and some other countries in the periphery, and this was sustained and practiced using the tributary system in the imperial times in China. But in addition to this imperialist idea of 天下, we also have this more cosmopolitan idea of 天下 that does not highlight hierarchy or center periphery, but to highlight the world as a whole, and not equality necessarily, but ethics and values and common good, collective good of the world as a whole. I think in that perspective, and that is what these 天下 idea can contribute to the current world. So of course, these ideas are coupled with the tradition or the historical events. In terms of the Anglo-American imperial, I think I also read a lot of relevant discussions. For example, this made me a bit uncomfortable. For example, when I was reading John Stuart Mill, he was discussing liberty, and then he was saying that there are certain countries are more civilized and those are uncivilized, and we only give those civilized countries, people, the liberty to develop. And also he attributed the failure of China in the modern times, in the 19th century, for example, to the lack of liberty, to the lack of freedom and agency, which I didn't agree with. But there are a lot of such ideas. What I think is more important is not to stick with the entirely original idea of the idea per se, because this is not hermeneutical research of what was said by the authors, but try to learn from them and use those ideas in the current world and see how these ideas can contribute to the tackling of the current problems and issues. That's how I tackle with those.
Okay, thank you, Lily. We have two more questions. So let's start with Tessa and then Jakob.
Thank you. Lily, I wanted to return to what you just mentioned about choosing Amartya Sen as part of the Anglo-American influence. And I was looking back at your slides, and I think you mentioned the way you asked the questions for the book was more about what influenced or what the rationales were in the Anglo-American approach to higher education. And is that how you justify Amartya Sen in that space? Because I think if you look at development as freedom, for example, of course, he relies heavily on Rawls and others, and he's building on that tradition. But I think he's also influenced by poverty and post-colonial settings. And that brings in something a bit different, I think, into the arguments he makes in the capability approach and development as freedom, and as freedoms being something to achieve. So I was wondering how you rationalize using Amartya Sen in this approach, given that you're using this distinctive comparative approach with geographic sort of boundaries.
Okay.
I'm afraid we lost Lily.
Yeah, maybe not for good, but let's check. She's connecting through VPN from mainland China and experience some bye-bye, Asgar. Experience some problems, but let's wait. Let's give her a few minutes. We can say goodbye to Asgar.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian, and all the rest for organizing it. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And Lily is back, so yeah.
So sorry. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
I'm sorry that can I quickly respond to Tessa's question, because I catch the first half and lost the last half, I think. I think this is what I noticed as well while I was reading Amartya Sen, and his work has been influenced by Indian ideas as well, like Bengali ideas. I could see a lot of influence from that strand. The reason, the rationale for me to include him as Anglo-American is because of his influence in Anglo-American world. Not necessarily saying that he himself is purely Anglo-American, but because saying that his work has been so important for higher education, for education. For example, his discussion of capability and agency freedom, and these are so important. So that's the reason why I included him. And to a large extent, his higher education, he was educated in Anglo-American countries, and he's working mostly in Anglo-American countries, but mostly because of his influence.
Thank you very much, Lily, for your inputs. And we have a final question by Jakub.
Oh, right. Thank you, Lily. It was super interesting. I mean, I'm very compelled to read the book after your talk, and it was a pleasure. So for me, what is especially interesting is your effort to sort of take Anglo-Saxon concepts, take Chinese concepts, and figure out to what extent we can put them together. And you already in your presentation mentioned that there are of course some limits, and it's very hard to find equivalents, and those are only some kind of approximations of concepts that are present in either of those traditions. And my question is my question is more about your effort to try to discuss the possibility of combination of this tradition. So how you perceive this effort? Is it for you a sort of effort towards universalizing both those traditions? Because I was thinking that in such a move in which you take two traditions together, do you sort of abolish those traditions into something new that strives towards some kind of bigger universality? Or this move is for you rather an effort to secure what is fundamental to both of those traditions? So this is sort of maybe more philosophical question, but really interesting for me. So very interesting in your comments. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you, Jakub. Absolutely great question. So this is also because I didn't have much time to talk about my methodology, the transpositional study, the transpositional comparison and combination. So the rationale of having, or the purpose of having is transpositional, because according to Amartya Sen, that when we observe something, our observation is unavoidably conditioned by the position that we are observing. For example, if we observe this from a Chinese perspective, we see these things like these. And then if we change our position, our observation may change, will not be the same. So he argued for the transpositional objectivity. When we observe from different positions, then we might achieve this transpositional point that we can develop more objective and more, not necessarily more objective, which I'm not saying it's more objective, but his words are more objective, but to have different way of looking at these phenomena of different observation by going transpositional. And that was the purpose, because we see a lot of challenges and problems in higher education, not limited to higher education today, and we don't see good solutions from one position. And perhaps a transpositional position, a combination of ideas may offer us something new that can be illuminating for tackling the problems. For example, this idea of equality of freedom and potential to self-cultivate, to self-achieve, is that it highlights both external support which is only in the Anglo-American, and also the equality of individuals' potential in self-achieving. So which is not so emphasized in Anglo-American, but in Chinese. If we can have these more harmonized situation, that we, when the external condition is harmonized with the individual efforts, individual inputs, then we may achieve better individual formation and also equality. So that's the purpose. It's not trying to claim universalism or more objective or so, but to develop new ideas that help us to tackle issues that are that cannot be offered from each. This is the major motivation. Another motivation is that there are a lot of misunderstandings at least between English and Chinese speaking worlds. They misunderstand each other many times. And this lack of understanding and misunderstanding is causing a lot of conflicts, tensions, and problems. And sometimes we only see the superficial differences and conflicts. Then the question is, what are the fundamental underlying reasons for these superficial differences and conflicts? And that's another reason why I was hoping to compare and then develop a common ground for mutual understanding and conversation and collaboration.
Yeah, I would say that.
Great, thank you very much.
Jakob.
But can I add something?
Sure.
Or
sure.
It's just during your talk, now when you were answering, I was thinking about a story which maybe you know, but if not, it might be of interest for you, because I'm not sure you know, but this is of course beyond Anglo-Saxon tradition, but it's still in the context of European tradition, Western tradition. Gottfried Leibniz actually tried to come up with the universal language, and he did it while grounding his efforts in Chinese alphabet, because he knew the Chinese traditions from Jesuits, and he was fascinated by Chinese alphabet, Chinese language, and the idea of sort of creating universal language in Western philosophy began with importing ideas from China. There is very nice philosophical debate about it, so it might be of interest for you in the context of your work. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakub. Could you share the name in the chat box? I'm not sure if I can spell it correctly.
Of course, yeah. Well,
Sure. Okay. So in the end, it will be a construction of a new universalism. But I would say I would like to have some space to express a friendly disagreement and explain why I think that Lily proposal is also a fruitful contribution, despite her claim that she focused on more epistemological perspective, like taking into account different subjects' positionalities, why she's also contributing to the understanding of the role of ontology between these two contexts of debates on higher educations. And I think that it's clearly visible. It was visible on one of the slides, like for example, when you were presenting the layered understanding of relation between the individual and the state. For me, this is not anybody's perspective of any national subject, cultural subject's perspective, but rather a clear ontological positioning of specific entities within the sphere that underlines any perception. Like that's the conceptual ontological underlying of seeing between these two traditions. And for this reason, I find this research really fascinating. And at the same time, I think that in your last comment, like it was clear that there is a nice combination between what you understand methodologically as your point and what Andrew, who came late to the seminar, unfortunately, present to us like in one of the during his seminar. I mean that Andrew was expressing the idea of seeing from the middle, like it was also, but using the queer theories and queer perspective, but it was really also a nice take on this transpositionality, which was really a transpositionality, like in his case. But I think that it's like wonderful start, the beginning of the discussion. But yeah, that's my comment. If anybody has any other comments, please feel free. Maybe Andrew want to add something by the end, or anybody. Oh.
Just a quick comment that, Christian,
Sure.
thank you for collaboration. I now am more convinced that I'm also dealing with ontology, because this reminds me of my discussion of 天下, the world, how the worldview, that I'm not only looking at how we epistemologically view the world, but also to more ontologically how the world is, what is the world, and how it is, what it is, more in an ontological sense. I'm now more convinced. Thank you.
Very well, very well. So I encourage you all to read Lily's book, because I really find it absolutely the rich set of resources for thinking, especially even if one wants to focus on some broader context within both of the traditions, or even go further and include the Humboldtian tradition to the mix. Lily provided a fundamental ground for any comparative research that is also important for any philosophy of higher education worthy of its name. I mean, any philosophy of higher education that takes into account the cross-cultural differences and possibility of philosophical thinking across the cultures, which are like underpinned by different ontologies, different epistemologies, different conceptual dictionaries. So thank you, Lily, for your contribution to this seminar. We'll post the recording soon, and we'll let you know about it being posted. I would like to invite all of you to our next seminar, not only within this series, which will be at the end of the May with Carolina Guzman, but also to a seminar next week with David Mills from Oxford University in our other series on science and semi-peripheries. You can find some info about this seminars on Twitter, on our website. Thank you very much, and have a good weekend. Yeah.
Thank you all, and I really appreciate your comments and feedback, and apologies for the internet. And
no apologies.
thank you.
Like my internet broke down, and this will be visible in the recording, unfortunately.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.